There is a river in South America that carries more water than the next 7 largest rivers on Earth combined. It drains a basin of 7 million square kilometers, an area larger than the entire continent of Australia. It contains more species of fish than the entire Atlantic Ocean. Its floodplain, when the annual rains raise the river by 15 meters, becomes an inland sea the size of England. Its mouth is so wide, nearly 300 kilometers from bank to bank, that early sailors approaching it from the Atlantic thought they had found a new ocean rather than a river. The fresh water it pours into the Atlantic is detectable by instruments 160 kilometers from the coast. It is the Amazon, the greatest river on Earth, the circulatory system of the largest tropical rainforest in the history of the planet, the home of more biological diversity than any other ecosystem on Earth. The river that the indigenous peoples of South America had known, navigated, fished, farmed, and built civilizations beside for thousands of years before any European had imagined it existed. And the first European to navigate it from the Andes to the Atlantic, the man whose name history has attached to the first complete descent of the Amazon by a European expedition, an 8-month journey through a world of such overwhelming biological richness and such extraordinary human complexity and such near-lethal physical hostility that the people who completed it were barely recognizable as the people who had started it, was a Spanish soldier from Extremadura named Francisco de Orellana, who set out from a camp in the Andes in December 1541 looking for food and never quite managed to go back. The story of the Amazon's discovery is not a simple story of a man with a plan and a destination. It is the story of a decision made in desperation, or possibly in opportunism. The historical sources are not entirely clear on which, and the distinction mattered enormously to the people Orellana left behind, that became, through the specific alchemy of 8 months of the most extraordinary river journey in the history of exploration, one of the most consequential geographical discoveries of the age of exploration. It is also the story of what was already there before Orellana arrived. Because the Amazon that Orellana navigated was not the empty wilderness that subsequent centuries of European geography would depict. It was a world of millions of people, civilizations of extraordinary sophistication built on the specific ecological productivity of the river's floodplain, cities and roads and ceramic traditions and agricultural systems of a complexity and a scale that the European explorers were neither intellectually equipped nor politically motivated to accurately report. The Amazon that Orellana described was populated, organized, productive, and complex. The Amazon that his successors found was not, because the specific combination of European disease and Spanish colonial violence that followed his descent had reduced what he had seen to a fraction of its former self within a generation. What happened between Orellana's Amazon and the Amazon of the century that followed it is one of the most consequential and most under-acknowledged demographic catastrophes in the history of the human species. And understanding it requires going back to the beginning, to the specific world that produced the expedition that produced the discovery. Francisco de Orellana was born in approximately 1511 in Trujillo, Extremadura, the same tough, poor, ambitious province that had produced Hernan Cortés, Francisco Pizarro, Vasco Núñez de Balboa, and a disproportionate share of the men who dismantled the great indigenous civilizations of the Americas in the 16th century. The Extremaduran background was not incidental. The specific combination of poverty and aristocratic pretension and the particular hardness of life in a region with limited economic opportunity produced the conquistador type with a reliability that made Extremadura the most consequential province in the history of Spanish colonialism. He arrived in the Americas as a teenager, part of the wave of young Spanish men who crossed the Atlantic in the decades after Columbus's first voyage, drawn by the stories of gold and glory that the initial conquests had generated and by the specific personal calculation that the Americas offered opportunities for advancement that the rigid social hierarchy of Spain could never provide. He was in Nicaragua by 1527. He was in Peru by the time of the Pizarro conquest of the Inca Empire, losing an eye in the fighting, the specific physical cost of the conquest that he wore for the rest of his life. He was rewarded for his service with a governorship at Guayaquil on the Pacific coast of what is now Ecuador, a position that gave him some standing in the colonial hierarchy but not the wealth and the glory that the Inca conquest had produced for the men who had arrived earlier and struck richer. The expedition that would eventually produce the Amazon discovery began not as an Amazon expedition at all, it began as a search for El Dorado. El Dorado, the Golden One, the gilded man, the king who covered himself in gold dust and washed it off in a sacred lake, the city, or the kingdom, or the ruler whose wealth in gold exceeded anything the Spanish had yet found in the Americas, was the most powerful and the most destructive geographical myth of the 16th century Spanish colonial world. It was partly based on real indigenous practices. The Muisca people of what is now Colombia did have a ritual involving a chief covered in gold dust being washed in a sacred lake, and the ritual was real, and the gold was real, and the story had traveled through the indigenous and then the European information networks until it had been transformed into something vastly larger and more literally golden than the original. Every expedition that went in search of El Dorado found poverty and jungle and hostile indigenous communities and death from disease and starvation. None of this stopped the next expedition from setting out, because the myth was more powerful than the evidence, and the specific combination of greed and faith that the conquistador world produced was not easily corrected by inconvenient reality. Gonzalo Pizarro, brother of Francisco Pizarro, the conqueror of the Inca, led the expedition that became the context for Orellana's Amazon discovery. In February 1541, he departed Quito in what is now Ecuador with approximately 240 Spanish soldiers and somewhere between 4,000 and 4,200 indigenous people who had been pressed into service as porters and guides. The specific brutal arithmetic of the conquistador expedition, in which the survival of the Spanish participants was purchased at the cost of the indigenous people who were forced to carry their supplies and whose lives were valued at approximately zero by the expedition's planners. Orellana joined the expedition at Quito as a volunteer, contributing his own men and resources to the enterprise in the hope of a share of whatever wealth it found. He was approximately 30 years old, experienced in the colonial world, physically toughened by years of Peruvian campaigning, and possessed of the specific combination of personal ambition and practical competence that the colonial world both produced and rewarded. The eastward crossing of the Andes was the first catastrophe. The Andes at the latitude of Quito are not gentle mountains. They rise to over 5,000 meters, their cloud forest slopes receiving extraordinary quantities of rain from the Amazon basin to the east. Their pass is cold and treacherous and often invisible in the cloud that gives the cloud forest its name. The expedition crossed them in conditions of severe cold and persistent rain, losing men and indigenous porters and horses and pigs and supplies at a rate that should have caused Gonzalo Pizarro to reconsider the enterprise before he had even reached the Amazon basin. He did not reconsider. He descended the eastern slopes of the Andes into the headwaters region of the Amazon basin, into a world of extraordinary biological richness and extraordinary navigational difficulty, where the rivers and the wetlands and the dense forest and the frequent flooding made overland movement slow and exhausting, and where the promised land of El Dorado and the cinnamon forests that had been the expedition's other stated objective remained perpetually just beyond the next river, just over the next ridge, always reported by the next indigenous community to be nearby and never actually there. By December 1541, 10 months after leaving Quito, in conditions of desperate food shortage, the expedition had reached the confluence of the Coca and Napo rivers in what is now eastern Ecuador. The men were starving. The indigenous porters, those who had survived, were dying of exhaustion and disease. The horses were gone. The supplies were reduced to almost nothing. The cinnamon and the gold remained entirely theoretical. Gonzalo Pizarro made a decision that reflected both the desperation of the situation and the specific logic of the Amazonian landscape. He would send a smaller party downriver in the brigantine that the expedition had built during its march, to search for food and find the populous country that indigenous informants kept promising lay just downstream. The brigantine, a flat-bottomed river boat built by the expedition's carpenters during the march, using whatever timber was available and whatever iron the expedition had carried from the Andes, would go ahead with approximately 60 men under the command of Francisco de Orellana and return with food within 12 days. Orellana never returned. What happened next? Whether Orellana made a genuine decision to continue downstream when it became physically impossible to return against the current, or whether he made a deliberate choice to abandon Gonzalo Pizarro and his starving army in the jungle and take the only operational boat to fame and fortune on his own account, is the central historical controversy of the Amazon story, and it has never been fully resolved. Orellana's own account, and the account of the Dominican friar Gaspar de Carvajal who accompanied the downstream expedition and whose chronicle is the primary source for everything that followed, presents the inability to return against the current as genuine and the decision to continue as the only rational response to an impossible situation. Gonzalo Pizarro's account, he eventually returned to Quito with approximately 80 survivors of the original 4,000, having endured one of the most nightmarish retreats in the history of exploration, characterized Orellana's failure to return as deliberate desertion and demanded that he be tried for treason. The current of the upper Amazon and its tributaries, in the rainy season of late 1541, was entirely capable of making an upstream return impossible for a lightly armed brigantine with 60 hungry men. The downstream pull of a river draining the entire eastern slope of the Andes in flood season is a physical force of significant magnitude, and the specific combination of current speed and the absence of any ability to resupply from the riverbanks, the jungle on either side offering no food that the expedition could reach quickly enough to sustain men already weakened by months of starvation, makes Orellana's account at least plausible. What is certain is that on December 26, 1541, Orellana's brigantine passed the point of no return and began the journey that would become the first European navigation of the Amazon River. The expedition had approximately 60 Spanish soldiers. The brigantine was small, poorly built, and not designed for the kind of extended river navigation they were about to conduct. They had minimal provisions. They had no idea how long the river was or where it went, except that rivers flow to the sea and the sea was somewhere to the east. Carvajal's Chronicle of the Journey, the Journal of the Discovery of the Amazon River, written by the Dominican friar who observed and recorded everything with the specific quality of a man who understood that he was witnessing something extraordinary, is one of the most remarkable documents in the literature of exploration. It is the primary record of a world that was about to be destroyed, a description of the Amazon basin in its last generation before epidemic disease and colonial violence reduced its population to a fraction of what Carvajal described. And what he described was extraordinary. The river banks were lined with settlements, not small fishing villages but towns of considerable size, some stretching for miles along the river bank with populations in the thousands. The settlements were connected. There were roads, Carvajal reported, roads broad enough for several people to walk abreast, connecting the riverside settlements to communities in the interior. The people were numerous, far more numerous than the jungle environment of the Amazon basin that 19th and 20th century travelers would observe could have supported, which is precisely what made Carvajal's account so controversial for so long. European geographers of the 19th century, seeing the sparse and semi-nomadic populations of the 19th century Amazon, simply refused to believe what he had described. They assumed he was exaggerating. He was not. The food situation resolved itself in the early weeks of the journey. The riverside settlements provided, through a combination of trade, negotiation, and outright seizure, the food that kept the expedition alive long enough to continue. Turtle eggs and manatee and river fish and the manioc and the maize that the Amazonian communities cultivated in their floodplain gardens, the specific extraordinary productivity of the varzea, the seasonally flooded forest that lines the Amazon's banks and that was cultivated by the indigenous communities into one of the most productive agricultural systems in the pre-Columbian world. The encounters with indigenous communities were the dominant feature of the 8-month journey, sometimes friendly, involving trade and communication through interpreters and the exchange of small gifts, and sometimes violent, involving attacks by warriors in large war canoes and the specific terror of the Spanish soldiers being outnumbered by thousands of indigenous fighters, whose knowledge of the river and the forest gave them tactical advantages that the Spanish muskets and crossbows only partially offset. The most famous of these violent encounters, and the one that gave the river its European name, occurred in June 1542, somewhere in what is now Brazil. The expedition was attacked by warriors including, according to Carvajal's Chronicle, women fighters who were in the front rank of the attackers. Tall, light-skinned, long-haired women who fought with the same ferocity as the men and who killed several of Orellana's soldiers before the attack was beaten back. Orellana named the river the Rio de las Amazoas, the River of the Amazons, after the female warriors of Greek mythology, whose classical stories every educated Spaniard of his generation knew. Whether Carvajal's account of the women warriors is accurate, or whether it represents a mythological overlay applied to something more mundane, women present in the attacking force in a support role, or indigenous men whose long hair and light build Carvajal interpreted as female through a cultural lens already primed by the classical mythology, has been debated by historians ever since. The name stuck. The river became the Amazon. The female warriors, real or mythological, gave the greatest river in the world the name it carries 5 centuries later. The journey continued east. The river widened. The tributaries that joined it from north and south were themselves rivers of enormous size. Rivers that would be the largest rivers in any other continent were here mere tributaries of the main channel, adding their flow to the growing mass of water that was carrying the expedition toward the Atlantic at a speed and in a direction that the current determined rather than the navigators. The forest on both banks remained continuous, an unbroken canopy stretching to every horizon, the specific overwhelming biological richness of the tropical rainforest pressing to the river's edge and generating the heat and the humidity and the insect life and the animal sounds that never ceased. They reached the mouth of the Amazon in August 1542, 8 months after leaving Gonzalo Pizarro's camp in the Andes, having traveled approximately 6,000 kilometers down the greatest river on Earth. The estuary was so wide that for a time they were not sure whether they had reached the river's mouth or the open ocean. The specific disorienting experience of standing in fresh water with no land visible in any direction, the river's mouth wider than most bodies of water they had ever seen. They navigated through the estuary and out into the Atlantic, built a second small vessel from whatever materials they could find to supplement the original brigantine, and sailed north along the coast to the Spanish colonial settlements of the Caribbean. Orellana returned to Spain. He reported the discovery. He was received with the specific ambivalent welcome of a man who had done something extraordinary and also abandoned the brother of the most important conquistador in Peru to die in the jungle. The charges of treason from Gonzalo Pizarro had preceded him. He spent years navigating the Spanish colonial bureaucracy, trying to get authorization and resources for a return expedition to the Amazon, arguing the case for the river's importance and the wealth of the civilizations along its banks with the specific frustrated energy of someone who has seen something magnificent and cannot convince anyone with the power to fund it to believe him. He eventually got his expedition. He returned to the Amazon in 1545 with 4 ships and approximately 500 men, intending to establish a Spanish colony on the river and exploit the wealth and the populations that his first journey had documented. The expedition was a catastrophe of almost comprehensive scale. 2 of the 4 ships were lost at sea before reaching the Amazon. The attempt to navigate the river's mouth failed multiple times in the specific meteorological and navigational difficulty of the Amazon estuary. Disease reduced the expedition's strength continuously. Orellana himself died, probably of fever, in November 1546, somewhere in the Amazon estuary, approximately 35 years old, his second Amazon expedition having achieved nothing except the deaths of most of its participants. He was buried in the river he had discovered. Which is, in its way, the most fitting possible end for the man who navigated it first. The Amazon that Carvajal described, the populated, productive, civilized river world of 1541 to 1542, was gone within a generation. The epidemic diseases that European contact introduced to the Amazonian populations, smallpox, measles, influenza, and the specific combination of new diseases to which the indigenous population had no immunity, moved faster than any European expedition and killed with a thoroughness that no military campaign could have matched. By the time the next European expeditions descended the Amazon in the second half of the 16th century, the riverside towns that Carvajal had described were empty, the roads were overgrown, the populations were fractions of what they had been. European geography concluded that Carvajal had exaggerated. The Amazon was a wilderness, sparse and inhospitable, incapable of supporting large populations. This conclusion, more comfortable than the alternative, which required acknowledging the demographic catastrophe that European contact had caused, persisted as the dominant view of Amazonian prehistory until the late 20th century, when archaeological research began recovering the evidence of what had actually been there. The archaeological research of the past 30 years has confirmed, in substantial detail, the world that Carvajal described. The terra preta, the dark earth, the specific anthropogenic soil that the Amazonian civilizations created through centuries of composting and charcoal addition, and that is among the most fertile soil in the world, is found across millions of hectares of the Amazon basin, the physical evidence of intensive agriculture at a scale that requires large populations to create. The earthworks, The geometric ditches and mounds and causeways and fish ponds and raised field systems that aerial archaeology and LiDAR imaging have been finding across the Amazon basin in increasing numbers are the physical remains of the infrastructure of civilizations that were genuinely as complex and as large as Carvajal described. The Amazon was not empty before Orellana. It was full. And the European arrival, the diseases that traveled faster than any expedition, the violence that followed, emptied it within a generation in one of the largest and most rapid demographic collapses in human history. The river is still there. Still carrying 1/5 of all the fresh water on Earth. Still the largest river system in the world. Still the home of more biological diversity than any comparable ecosystem. Still the circulatory system of the largest tropical rainforest that has ever existed on this planet, though the rainforest is smaller now than it was in 1542, and is getting smaller in ways that the climate science of the 21st century is documenting with the specific cold authority of data that tells you what is happening while it is still happening. Orellana navigated it first. He named it after warrior women. He gave the world the knowledge that the greatest river on Earth existed, and that it could be navigated, and that it flowed through a world of extraordinary human richness that the world outside the Amazon had not known existed. He died in the river before he could tell the full story. Carvajal told it for him. And the river has been telling it ever since.